I really wanted to ask you about the biography of the World War II cargo pilot, just in terms of like how that relationship happened. The name of the book again is The Up Perspective, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, the first one in that series actually was called Should Have Been With Me. The Up Perspective was the second one, and then actually writing a third one called the Titmates, which is the final three in the series. But what this is a, like I said, World War II cargo pilot. He's from Eaton, Indiana, some little small town. He flew over the Himalayas. They call it the Hump. I think they made several movies about it and such. In C-47 cargo planes, basically dropping cargo down to the advancing troops into China and such like that. In Japan, actually, China is where they're fighting, but they're not fighting the Chinese, if you know history. But so he comes back, and then he starts developing the first satellites that the U.S. launched into space when there was a big space race between the Soviets, the Russians.
The whole Sputnik.
And so So I detail all that and how that came about. Why am I writing about this? Because I'm typically, at this point, I'm usually writing nonfiction autobiographies and philosophical books, and that one about the religion that you mentioned here. How did I get into these biography books? I have a friend that goes to auctions, and so he went to this auction probably 20, 30 years ago and found all this material by this man that I write in the book. His name's Wilfred Skull. He's deceased now. But he finds all this material, all his old records and pictures and all this stuff from the war. And he finally, 20 years later, after he meets me, he's like, hey, you're beginning to write books. Do you want to maybe look at this material and see if you can do something with it? So he drives it all the way down to Florida, all the way from Indiana, in this big, steam chest where all this stuff has it. And that's what the front of the book Should Have Been Me is. It's the steam chest. It's the war chest that he has.
Gotcha.
But anyhow, so I go through all this and try to see if there's some kind of cohesive story, and I find out all these weird connections that this guy was Eaton, Indiana, and all these other things, and even the place that this guy met me at, the friend from Indiana, we came down and he met me in a restaurant called Eaton Beach. I'm like, well, all these weird connections that, like, what in the world is going on here?
It's like when the universe conspires to say, hey, yes, you should write this.
Yes, and that's exactly what was going on. That was exactly what was going on. And what's different, this guy, the World War veteran, he didn't have any children. He died when he didn't produce any children. So his legacy and the story, everything about it would have gone with him. His wife, 94-year-old woman, didn't know what to do with all these pictures, so she gave them away and they sold them at auction.
Wow.
And fortunately, we brought them back and turned them into a book. I contacted her later and then gave her books, and her children, because she had children by another husband previously, her children came to the book signing that I held eventually in Eaton, Indiana, because I took the book and went back to Eaton, Indiana, to where he was from, and held a big book signing there.
Oh, that's great.
And then we continued on the story and wrote more about the fact that he was not only just in the war, but he came back and that perspective is more about his time as being the satellite engineer. And then the last book I'm currently working on, which should be out before Christmas, is called Tentmates. It's about the four guys, him and three other guys, that stayed inside this tent in Moran, India, and experiences they had, and coming back, and how their lives diverged and where they were from. It's just a little bit about humanity in general. So,
gotcha. Wow, that's definitely a fascinating series right there.
Now, I don't think it's important that we keep that somewhere. We especially from a guy who didn't have any children. I call his satellites his children because he didn't have any children. Put out 6 satellites. It's called the OGO satellites, and one of them just crashed. I think it was in 2018. He's been up in space since the late 60s, I think, maybe early 60s. All that time, just going around and around, and finally crashed. Shortly after I published the first book, I was like, "There's too many weird connections here,"
oh, man.
which led to the book, which you'll get to, is the universe.
Gotcha. Before we get to that one, though, you are able to, I guess, like maybe like through like a NASA website or something like that, to track like the satellites, like their positionings, or like if they're still active or not.
Yeah, there's different places you can go, but this was an actual story that I had come across the news thing that the OGO satellite's coming down. I was like, OGO, what? Wait a minute, this is the guy who created these satellites. They were called the orbital geopositional satellites, something like that, because they were just mapping positions at the time. They weren't really as advanced as we have now. And there's just a news story about how they were gonna force it crash landing into the ocean by Maui. It's like, wow, this is the guy's actual satellites. His babies are coming home. The last one. He created like 6 of them, and the first one, for some reason, stayed in space longer than the other ones.
Wow. And it is pretty cool that you were able to create that work to like live on forever. You know what I mean? Like
yeah,
you said,
now hopefully it lives on forever.
Disappeared.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.